Good evening. It's my honor and privilege to welcome you to the BW Dialogue. Today we'll be talking to two special guests, authors of a book that talks about unshackling India. Let me welcome both the authors, Mr. Ajay Chhibber.
I'm here.
Yes, Mr. Chhibber, welcome. Thank you for joining us. We know you're in Washington, so thank you for joining us from there. We appreciate your time. I know there were some tech issues, so we're a little late, but we are here. Now, Mr. Chhibber is the first Director General. He's been, in the past, he's been the first Director General of India's independent evaluation organization with the status of the Minister of State, which was established in the past to assess the effectiveness of India's various development programs. He was also from July 2008 to July 2013. For 5 years, he was the former United Nations Assistant Secretary General and the Assistant Administrator for the UNDP. He did his schooling from the St. Paul's, Darjeeling. He also received his training as an economist at the Stanford University. He did his PhD in 1983 and also studied at Delhi School of Economics in 1976. When he did his MBA, he is received an BA in Economics from St. Stephen's College in Delhi University, and where he received the David Rajaram Prize for the Best All-Rounder in 1974. I can go on about his achievements and qualifications, but he currently serves as the visiting scholar at the George Washington's University Institute for International Economic Policy. Welcome, Mr. Chhibber. Congratulations on this new book, Unshackling India. Possibly the serendipity, we need it at the right time. We also have the co-author, Mr. Salman and his Source, who's an economic consultant and helps institutions and countries really get their economic development policy right. So welcome, Mr. Source. Comes from a lineage of policymakers and politicians. So let me first start by asking both of you. First, Mr. Chhibber, and then Mr. Source. Mr. Chhibber, the last 19 months have been very different for all of us than what we've seen throughout our life. How have been the last 19 plus months for you, both personally and professionally?
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Batra. It's really a pleasure to be with you again. And I always enjoy talking to you and also listening to you. Of course, pandemic has been a kind of a shock to the entire system. And, in many ways, a personal shock to all of us for our lives, how they have been upended. Of course, but it also gave a time to reflect a little bit and say, where is this world headed and where is our country, which is the focus of our book, headed? Where has it come from? And where do we need to go? And perhaps the pandemic can be a bit of a shock to the system because as the book lays out, things were not working so well even before the pandemic and certainly during the pandemic. So it's a kind of a wake-up call. And then I happen to, although we are from the same college, Salman is so much younger than me. So I didn't meet him in college, but we did meet here actually near Washington. And we got to like each other very much. And then both of us had been thinking about these issues, and we decided that let's get together and use this opportunity to, lay out where we are, what the pandemic has wrought onto the system, what it has exposed, and therefore, where can India go in the next 25 years so that by the time we reach 100 years of independence, we have this opportunity to reset for the 21st century, so to speak. So we titled the book Unshackling India because we feel that there is a lot in India which shackles people's aspirations, people's ability to get things done. Indians do so well outside of India. So why can't Indians do well in India? And how can we, especially the young people, we have a very young population, how can they be unshackled to realize their true potential? Let me
Thank you so
stop here
much.
and
Yeah. Now I'll bring Mr. Salman, and he's sold, again, he's an economic development expert, author, commentator. His experience at the World Bank really gives him a view on development in economics. He was involved in issues relating to climate change, sustainability, and many strategic issues, disaster risk management, urban development. He's evaluated partnerships. He's worked in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia. So really, he has a point of view which is nuanced. As Mr. Chhibber mentioned, they went to the same university. Mr. Soos, how have been the last 19 months for you, both personally and professionally? We'll come to the book and its content, and we'll talk about some of the issues that you raised there and the solutions that you suggest there. But first of all, a philosophical comment from you.
Well, first, let me thank you, Dr. Batra, and thank you to Businessworld for organizing this dialogue, having us over to discuss our book. But the pandemic has actually been pretty tough. It's been very tough I'm sure, for all of us. I was in the States, in the US, at the time the pandemic hit, and I got stuck there. My family was in Kashmir out here. And my parents got COVID, and other family members got COVID, and it was a very difficult time. And it was not easy to look at what was happening in India, because I think there was complacency in India, and I think seeing dead bodies floating, in rivers, buried next to on riverbanks. People desperate for oxygen or any kind of medication. I think it was a very tough and humbling time. But it was also a reminder that we cannot take things for granted. This is in some ways a dress rehearsal. This pandemic is not over. There could be worse things coming up, and climate change is something that is in some ways going to be the big elephant in the room. And all of these things will impact India. All of these things will impact poor countries disproportionately. And I think, given that we were stuck in the States, so Ajay and I kind of kept talking about these issues. We care deeply about these issues. And we worked together at the World Bank. We went to St. Stephen's together, but we became friends on the golf course. And this book originated during a conversation. While we were playing, but we were also kind of, there's no fun in playing when you're so much on your mind. So then we started, and here we are today with you.
Thank you so much. Now let me dive into the book immediately. Of course, the title of the book is very explanatory and suggestive. I read the book, and there are 19 chapters in the book. Which is your favorite chapter and why? And I'll come to each of the chapters or some of the chapters and ask you my questions. But I'd like to ask first Mr. Soul, and then I'll come to Mr. Chhibber. Which is your favorite chapter and why?
Okay, that's easy for me, because my favorite chapter is, there are two. There's one on women, where I say, we talk about feminizing the economy, because that is such, an unutilized asset for India. India has to do a lot more to make women participate in the economy. Women's participation in India's social and economic life.
That's the chapter 7, Women in the Workforce.
That's the chapter, Women in the Workforce. But equally, I think for me, the climate change chapter is very, very interesting, because we not only talk about the impact this is going to have in India and what India can do, but in climate change, there are so many possibilities for India. But there's also this kind of historical context for climate change in that chapter. So I think it's a self-contained chapter, and I think readers will enjoy getting into the history of climate change, getting into some of the technical stuff, but then trying to figure out how India is going to be impacted and what kinds of opportunities India might have because of climate change. So it's not only a negative. I think there's a lot of positive stuff here.
Absolutely. And Mr. Chhibber, your favorite chapter?
So, it's hard to pick a favorite chapter, Mr. Batra. It's like picking which is your favorite child, since you and
But I would imagine you have 2 or 3 children, but you have 19 chapters to choose from.
Yeah.
That's the only distinction I make.
Well, chapter 19, of course, summarizes it all beautifully. So I would say chapter 19. But if
which is your conclusion, where you say the economy India deserves. That's the chapter you're talking about.
Exactly. That's the chapter. Because not only does it show the path forward, but it lays out, it summarizes actually the findings of all the other 17 chapters, more or less. But if you pushed me very hard to pick one of the 17, I mean, forget the chapter 1, which sort of India and the world, and the last one, the entire section on the role of the state, I think the first 3 chapters, chapter 2, 3, 4, probably are where I would put my finger as sort of the big change, the big sort of mindset change that India has to make, that this my-bap relationship that we have between the citizen and the state has to change in a very fundamental way if we are to make that kind of progress, and if we are able to handle these kind of emergencies like pandemics, like Salman talked about, climate change coming forward. The state has been exposed to some extent by the pandemic as a weak state, because it is not able to handle even this kind of an emergency, let alone the many more that are to come, and in a way stifles people's initiative through a myriad of laws and all kinds of intervention. That it's a very interventionist state.
That's the title of your first chapter. Second chapter,
that,
in the part
that would
1.
that would be kind of my favorite. If you forced me to pick my favorite child without revealing to all the other children that this was my favorite, then that would be it.
Okay, now let me dive right into the book. Of course, the title is suggestive. Once you read the book, or the 5 parts in which the book is divided, you know the focus. But let me start with the first chapter. The first chapter is about India and the world in the 21st century. Tell me, in the last 20 months, in the last few years, how is India looking vis-a-vis the world in the 21st century?
Well, unfortunately, from where we were, from where we saw the world, I think India was not looking very good, and we were very concerned. And I think the problem with this particular crisis, as opposed to the global financial crisis of 2008, was that India was heading into the crisis, and we're focusing more on the economy. So India was headed into this crisis in a relatively weak kind of position. And this crisis, which pretty much simultaneously hit countries around the world, we could see that a state, because the capacity is so limited in India, despite the fact that we're a 1.3 billion people country, despite the fact that India is a member of the G2, despite the fact that India's an almost $3 trillion economy, we know that state capacity is extremely limited. And when this pandemic hit, we were concerned first with the kind of data we were seeing, because we didn't think that the data was actually, we were not testing enough, first of all, for COVID-19. When we were not testing enough, we knew that many cases would not be found. We knew that because there's so much poverty, people may not even know what they've died of. That may not get recorded. And that may lead to complacency. And I think that led to complacency. And then when the second wave came, we were not prepared, because we had already in some ways felt that the worst is behind us. But the worst was not behind us. And what we saw in some other countries was that the focus on testing, the focus on getting ready for vaccinations, I think those kinds of things told us that because we focus a lot in this book on bringing international comparisons into the picture, trying to learn from what the rest of the world is doing.
But what about I have to say that I agree that we could have done better. I don't think anyone can disagree with that. But also, we have been able to achieve vaccination. 1 billion, and I read a story in CNN that day, and I wrote a piece. The CNN story said 1 billion vaccinated, millions go without first dose, which is okay. The job is media is to be able to look at what is not done and just not always look at what's done. That's fine. But I also thought that the world media is sometimes very unfair. Sometimes, yes, I mean, it ran specials, BBC and CNN ran specials on India on where we were lacking, which is fine, we were, right? But at the same time, these countries haven't been able to do their vaccination as compared to us. I mean, look at the US. There are still people who, thanks to the last president, who believe vaccination doesn't work. They don't need vaccination. Yeah. In all the states where Republican, strongholds are there, they don't believe in vaccination. In Europe, I can give you states which you know of who haven't been. So what about that? We've been able to get our vaccination act together. I would want a comment from both of you.
Let me come to this issue. So I think, you are absolutely right. Of course, we didn't do so well in the beginning. We were too complacent. But once the realization came, there were times when I heard people from government, I won't name them, who were saying, we have solved the problem after the first wave. We don't even need to bother about vaccination. And while we had the largest vaccination producing capacity in the world, we let that capacity sit there for quite a while until the second wave came, and then the realization came, and then the switch went on, and then of course the government got into action, and then the vaccination process started. And you're right in that. And as we say as we show in chapter 2 to 4, what is an amazing mystery to me is how India can do so well in certain things, specific things like the ISRO program, fire a rocket, run an election, organize, say, a Kumbh Mela even. But yet, and in this case, vaccinate people. These are very specific tasks where the government seems to, under an emergency, get into an action. But on a day-to-day, the education, the health, the basic health care, the basics of life are not being delivered as they are in other countries. And as Salman says very rightly, in India, people always tell you, we are doing much better than we were 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But, the world doesn't stand still. The world moves on. And so you have to be benchmarking yourself against what the rest of the world is doing. And as we show in the book, on a range of issues, from health, education, delivering of a whole variety of services. If I look at the cost of doing business in India, and I look at a variety of things that the business sector has to face, we have to benchmark in that way internationally, which is what we have tried to do in the book. That doesn't take away from your original point that yes, we have vaccinated, but that's like I said, this is a state that is able to deliver specific things when it gets its mind to it very well. But the day-to-day basics, which lead to long-term development, seem to be suffering. That's how I would put it.
Okay, let me shift gears. And now, in your part 1, chapter 2, the title of the chapter itself is suggestive and gives away what's in the chapter. You talk about India's intervention state, and you say if reduce its scope, it should increase its effectiveness. Mr. Souls, I would request you to build on that. And since Mr. Chhibber said that's his most favorite chapter, I definitely want a comment from him on that.
Well, that's the title says it all. Now, what are we trying to say? We are saying, because the governments, we're looking at the government, whether it's the central government, whether it's the state government, whether it's local government, we feel, and this is not feeling, this is based on research, that the government gets involved in things that it probably should not be getting involved, but does not do enough of a good job in areas where it should get involved.
Absolutely.
So that's the opposite of what should happen. So you're on the one hand, you're intervening a lot. On the other hand, your state capacity is limited. You don't have enough the kinds of professionals who will run your government at different levels. But you have many people who are in some ways hangers-on and other things who are dispersed throughout government and are not able to add value in that sense. So your state capacity is limited and you're trying to do too many things. Now, along with this, I think what is important for us to keep in mind is that India is a vast, vast country. Governance has to be excellent at all of its levels. Somehow I feel that when we think of government, we say, oh, the government in New Delhi. It's always government in New Delhi. Our focus should shift to government in a panchayat. Till we start thinking of a much more decentralized model where people in panchayats are some of the best professionals that you can find, you can't really have a good governance model. So we don't really think it is the government's job to be in, say, making hotels. But the government, to my mind, could be in public education, school education, and should do a good job there. The government should do a good job of national defense. Those kinds of things the government should be in. But the government tries to do too many things with very limited resources.
Okay.
And I think that is what the problem is.
Mr. Chhibber, your commentary on top of what Mr. Soh said?
No, I think he said it very well. We think of, again, if you just look around the world, think of, let's say, China. You think of China as a very totalitarian, authoritarian state. And would you know, as we point out in the book, that more than 50% of spending in China is done at the local level, not even at the provincial level. In India, that share is less than 5%. Your panchayats and your mayors are so starved of resources, right? Now, we've had the Finance Commission, which has, I think the 14th Finance Commission, shifted more resources to the states. But shifting money from Delhi to Lucknow, to a state capital where the population is over 230 million, is hardly any decentralization, right? So we go on to also point out in the book that with a population of 1.5 billion or so, roughly 30 million, the size of a province should be optimally around 30 million. And provinces that have been, states that have been broken up. I mean, I come from, like you, from Punjab, Haryana. I still remember when Punjab was broken up into Haryana and Himachal and Haryana areas which were very backward took off. Similarly, we are seeing now in Uttaranchal. So I think India will have to think about sort of 50 states at least. And then, as Salman was saying, it's not only at the provincial level, but it's at the local level that greater. Now, one thing we point out is property taxation, which is the revenue source of local administration. And there also, there is so many constraints. We have one of the lowest property tax collections in the world, as we show in our book. So that's an area where you don't need to be taking money from the union government or from the state government to fund local services. You could be increasing revenue through property taxation or other forms of user charges that local authorities should be allowed to collect. So I'm going into some detail here, but just to point out that when you do that kind of benchmarking of India and some of the other middle-income countries even, our spend at the local level is so low. What it does is it makes government very expensive also. Because when you try to do everything at the union level, if you look at the pay scales at the union level or at the provincial level and then at the local level, there's a huge difference, right? So if you try to do everything at the union level, you are actually spending a lot of money on wages and salaries, which would be much better spent on services for you to be able to conduct those services. So, and by any principle of subsidiarity that we learn in public finance, we are contravening that in spades here in India. So I think that's a big push that we make in this book in that direction.
Thank you so much. Now, we also do this in the backdrop of a new national education policy, which is very comprehensive. The late Sri Kasturi Ranganji really, led it, and it's really comprehensive and absolutely in the right direction. The key is to implementation, and you talk about education in a separate chapter. Now, tell me, what are the principal things that need to be tweaked in the education system, as you talk about in your chapter, that can really prepare the leaders, the thinkers and the doers of tomorrow? Because really, if there's one thing that we need to change in education, it will have as you talk about in the book, a spiraling effect on almost everything. Give us a peek from the chapter.
I think if there's one thing I would do for the education sector, I know you talked about the national education policy, and we actually talk about it. We praise it to extent, but we also point out that there could be some challenges ahead. But you said, what is one thing you would change about the education system? What I would change is actually maternal health. I would go to maternal health to change the education sector. You see, I think we have to get out of this mindset that we have to do something here in education for it to move. First, you have to see where the babies are.
The linkages.
The linkages are very yes. The linkages are very important. We have a very high and persistent malnutrition rate, high stunting rates. No matter how great your education system is, if these children do not have good nutrition, they don't have good brain development, they are not going to learn. Absolutely will not learn. Now, if you have 30-40% malnutrition rate, how can you have a developed economy? You cannot. So it starts for babies in the womb. That is what the mindset should be. Otherwise, what you will find is that in grade two students who cannot read a single word of a short text, 80% in India, 80%. Now, where does that place India? It places us in the ranks of Malawi and Ghana and Uganda. Actually, we're worse than Zambia. Grade 2 students who could not perform two-digit subtraction, more than 80%. Behind Uganda, behind Ghana, behind Nicaragua, behind Iraq. I mean, it all starts with looking at linkages. We come up with a national education policy and suddenly we feel that something's going to happen. No, it's not going to happen, because there are fundamental problems, there are structural problems, they need to be fixed. Also,
saying maternal health and tackle the malnutrition of children so that they can be, one, alive, and second, be in the schools to prosper,
Yes, so that their brains are ready to learn. Their brains are not ready to learn now. Even if you have a wonderful national education policy with the stamps from Ajay Chhibber, Salman, and everybody else. But imagine now for the other people who could benefit from this policy. What you need to think about is governance of the education sector. Governance of the education sector is still very centralized. You have CBSE people with mandates. We have state boards with mandates. Meanwhile, countries have no involvement. So again, decentralization as a concept applies pretty much throughout this book, throughout sectors. So I think we have to think about those things as well. Ajay, do you want to add something here?
No, I was just going to say exactly what you just said, which is that, the teacher absenteeism. You have a great national education policy, but how are you going to solve that problem? And that problem can only be solved if the teachers are accountable to people at the local level.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm not naive enough to say that whatever works in Kerala, where panchayats hire the teachers, will work, say, in Bihar. Not to pick on Bihar, but just to pick another state where, the panchayat leader might put his daughter-in-law as the teacher, and she never shows up to school, and they draw the salary. So, the governance has to be looked at in different ways, but just having a central national education policy is not going to address some of these issues of nutrition, teacher absenteeism, etc., the broader governance issues that you so rightly point out. But in our book, we don't have a one-shot solution on this. We just say, try experimentation at the state level and at the local level. You've got a framework with the national education policy, but now you should allow some flexibility at the local and state level to be able to deliver, learning to people, not just attendance at classrooms.
Move from, whether it's in classrooms or in organizations, we have to move from presentism to learning and outcomes,
Exactly.
Fun and outcomes in organization.
And Dr. Thakur, if I might add, because this is also a very important issue, and this is for both education and for health and for other things like social protection. We don't spend enough. And we don't spend it well. Whatever we spend, we don't spend it well. We don't even spend enough. Now, and by the way, when you look at this book, this is a very high level kind of overview of what is going on. You have to look at within state differences, right? So you have to look at interstate differences and then within states, what's happening. You have a state like Himachal Pradesh doing really well on education, spending quite a bit of money on education. In per capita terms, it's probably spending 3 times the money being spent in Maharashtra, 6 times the money spent in Bihar. How can India move forward if Bihari children and UP children are not getting any help? That's it in some ways puzzles me. That we think that we can get anywhere, we're going to become a developed economy unless we take care of these basics. These are basics. Bihari children and Uttar Pradesh children, we're failing them.
Got it. Now, I want to bring in my senior editor, Mr. Rohel Amin, into the conversation. We said we'd match a Punjabi with a Punjabi and a Kashmiri with a Kashmiri. That's how I got Mr. Rohel. But on a very serious note, before I bring Rohel into the conversation, I want to talk to Mr. Chhibber about two of the chapters. One is the chapter 14, which I personally like, powering services. Because if we really want to become that economy that we aspire to, both at the global scale and the micro entrepreneurs at the cluster level, then really this chapter for me is the most important, powering services. So give us a speak from this chapter for our viewers and readers.
So I think what we are saying there is, of course, India has if there's one thing India has done relatively well in, it's in the service sector. But at the same time, while we applaud our sort of initially the IT revolution that we had, and now subsequently a lot of the e-services that are moving forward in a very significant way, and the pandemic probably has actually accelerated some of that as well. At the same time, we have to realize that we are still, relative to the rest of the world, we are not just playing catch up. We are doing copycat, right? We are not the leaders in any sense in new technology, new innovation, etc. And a lot of that comes from how little we spend on research, as we point out in our book. We have our total research is about 0.5 to 0.6% of GDP. China is already above 2% of its GDP. So, think of China's GDP at around 12, 13 trillion. And they're spending, and the US spends even more at 2.5% of its GDP, which is over 20 trillion. So, you have to start thinking that you can't be just the backroom office boys, and that'll be good enough, and that all these platforms will come from abroad and invest here, and that will be the service sector. The potential is huge, and so I think and the use of some of this technology now also in network products in manufacturing, which is the new thing where we are also not at the frontier as compared to other countries. I mean, our total network product exports are only about $25 billion. So what I'm saying is the potential here is huge. Our capacity to take this on is there. We do have the intellectual capacity, as well as, we certainly, with some allocation of resources, we could take this on. There's also the service sector where then there's a whole area of what I call very low-hanging fruit that, tourism, etc., that I think that we haven't even touched the surface. Of course, the pandemic has made it harder now to address some of those, but I'm thinking more long-term, how we approach some of these issues as well. So I think that's very important, but at the same time, as we point out in the book, Mr. Batra, that we have had a kind of lopsided structural transformation, that the service sector will be creating lots of jobs, but not enough to absorb all those people that are in the farming sector. In the last few years, you've actually seen a decline in manufacturing employment and an increase in agricultural employment because people have nowhere to go. And a lot of them, the level of education they have, they are not employable even in the tech sectors, right, in the service sector. So you do need to rethink and go back to basic manufacturing as a source of employment. But that said, I think, the service sector, but Salman may want to add something there.
I think when we think about these neat divisions between services and manufacturing and agriculture, I think we lose something, because these days a lot of things that we may think of as manufacturing are actually services. We have you sell a car and then you have to service a car, and you can't just say that this is part of the manufacturing sector. It's the services. But I think what's happened in India is that even though services have become a big part of the economy, I think we need to, elevate, this sector to the higher value-added kind of services. I think if you're stuck in the lower value-added services, then it becomes a problem. I think what China has been doing is, of course, China did this huge kind of industrialization or manufacturing-based kind of push, but China now is a big service economy, and they are at the higher value-added kind of end of it. India needs to really stop. My suggestion would be that we should not be boasting about how great India is in services, but should actually say we're not very good in services, we got to improve. So India has to move up the value chain, and India has not done a good job of that. And the reason, again, is because of linkages. What are the linkages? An education sector. Is the education sector really coming up with the kinds of young men and women who are going to provide good services to the world? Does anyone seriously think that is happening? I don't think that's happening. So your education sector has to work a certain way. Similarly, if you go to this chapter on making in the age of machines, this new, the fourth industrial revolution chapter, manufacturing chapter, if you will, you can't really do well if you don't have good R&D. And you won't have good R&D because you don't have the kind of secondary and tertiary education system and the kind of government support that you need. We don't. Then you look at other aspects of the services sector, like, let's just take tourism, for example. Ajay talked about tourism. India, a country of 1.3 billion people, an ancient civilization, gets less foreign tourists than Macau.
Absolutely. I'm in the city of
I mean,
Paris.
it's
Just
shocking.
the city of Paris, and if Eiffel Tower get more
So,
with
so, so,
clearly we
so
have to we have a long way to go there.
we have a
I
long
want
way
to
to go.
bring
Yes.
Roel into the conversation.
Thanks.
And I want to ask you before I go, I want to ask you and Mr. Chhibber this question, which is the last chapter, which Mr. Chhibber said possibly is among the two most favorite chapters that he had. What is the economy that India deserves? And when do you see we achieving? Of course, it depends on what the government does, what the entrepreneurs do. Sometimes entrepreneurs can be that catalyst in making things happen with the same policy environment, with the same constraints that exist. What is the economy India deserves? And where will we in next 2-3 years?
So maybe I'll start and then Salman, or would you like to go first?
No, go
I
ahead,
can
go
just
ahead.
say, let me, we have a lovely quote. We found a lovely quote by the great Jamshedji Tata, where he says, I want, and this he said in, I think in the 1930s or 40s, I mean, long time back he said this, which is very interesting to me, which is why we put that quote into the book. He said, I don't want India to be an economic superpower. I want it to be a happy country. And the conclusion we come to is, you can be not one or the other. You can be either an economic superpower and a happy country, or a miserable country and not an economic superpower. Because the logic of that is, and this is where we start that chapter and end it in a way as well, is that if where we are today, say, our per capita income maybe less than $2,000. If we were to become what the World Bank classifies today as a developed country, let's say roughly around $12,000 per capita, we would certainly be an economic superpower. With our population and at $12,000, we would be a over $20 trillion economy, right? So just the sheer GDP numbers by itself will make us an economic superpower. But we will not be a happy country if we are where we have now reached almost the highest level of inequality in the world, as we show.
Thank you so much, Mr. So is your response before I hand it over to Mr.
Yeah, so I think that's where we kind of come out, is that we can be both a happy country and a prosperous country at the same time.
And I think that's quite right. I mean, India's inequality in India has grown tremendously, and this is not just a recent phenomenon. This has been going. I think after the 1991 reforms, inequality has actually kind of really grown. And there's no way to kind of say, no, this has not happened. It's happened. And it's actually become very sharp in the last 5-10 years. Now, that is not going to be good for India's future prospects. Will not be. We won't be a happy country, clearly. But you also talked about, how do you see the next few years? Well, the way I see the next few years is the way, say, the NCAER kind of sees it, and that is, I don't see India hitting kind of this pre-pandemic trajectory or getting to that level before 2028, 2029. That seems to be the general consensus, that it is going to take a while for India to get back to that growth trajectory that existed before the pandemic. That is, if this pandemic comes to an end relatively quickly. Even that is not guaranteed. So I think we're in for some turbulence. But my hope is that policymakers in India say to themselves, look, we're in a difficult situation. We need to figure out something by which we can recover lost ground very quickly. And I think the only way to do that is to go through some of the structural transformations that not just us, but so many have been talking about. we have to make some, we have some clear choices, that we must make. And without that, I think we're in trouble.
All the best, Mr. Chhibber and Mr. Soles. I've enjoyed talking to you, and I'll hand it over to my senior editorial colleague, Mr. Rohel Amin, for the next set of questions. Mr. Amin,
Thank you so much,
Mr. Chhibber, and Mr. Soles.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much,
Thank
Mr. Chhibber and Mr. Soos for joining us today. So we have another around 12 minutes left. So I have a couple of questions. One is, we spoke, in this book also you talk about India becoming a welfare state before becoming a developed state. And you have quite of underlined this point. And you have cited the example of China, how they have addressed the same problem with a different approach by creating jobs. So from here on, where we are, how can we undo what we have done so far? And is there a hope that we can, undo and move forward in a different direction? To you, Mr. Chhibber, first.
So I think, well, let me say that we are not against providing social assistance to people. I think we are spending close to 4 to 5% of GDP on various types of what I call handouts. But we are doing it in a very bad manner. A lot of that money actually doesn't even reach the poor people. For example, a lot of it goes into this PDS program, and more than half the money there is just storage costs of FCI rather than actually subsidies to the people. So, and you can run through many programs. When I first came to India 10 years ago to address people, they said India is not ready for cash transfer programs. But now, as we have seen, we have gone into DBT in a significant way. But I think that's the direction, that we need to focus on what I call people-based subsidies rather than product-based subsidies. And that will mean that you will actually be able to deliver more benefit, more help to people at the lower end of strata at a much lower cost than we are providing today. So that's kind of the direction in which we would like this to go. For example, in the farm agitation, we just saw, so much money goes into the MSP, minimum support prices. But if you expanded the PM Kisan program, which provides direct income support to the farmers, that would be a much more effective way to go and allow the farmers then more choice in the crops that they grow. So I can go on with many examples, but generally the thrust of it is not that you don't need social assistance, you do need it, but let's modernize it and let's do it the way the rest of the world is doing it these days, which is much more effective. And during the pandemic, as we have seen, countries with proper cash transfer programs, mobile cash transfer programs, so that the migrants were also not affected, have done much better than India has in helping people address the pandemic. Let me stop.
Mr. Soos, your thoughts?
Well, I think Ajay is quite right. Our intention is not to suggest that we should not be doing social assistance. In fact, Chapter 8 is about protecting the vulnerable. Having social protection is I think a fundamental duty for any kind of modern and inclusive government. So I think that is without question we have to do it. We just have to do it a certain way. We have to do it right. And I think unfortunately what has happened in India is that because of perhaps political compulsions that Ajay and I are free of to some extent, at least when we're writing the book, I think political compulsions on the one hand, on the other hand, with the economy not doing as well, I think what happens is that you do the easy thing. You can kind of say, okay, you know what, we're going to provide this kind of assistance because we can't provide jobs. Our feeling is that jobs are the best kind of social assistance you can have because that's what they need. People need jobs. If you have jobs, your poverty is going to come down. If you have jobs, you'll be a less unequal society. If you have jobs, you'll be a happier society. And if you have jobs, you'll be contributing to a social assistance fund eventually. That will ultimately help you when you're not earning a living. I think that is what modern social democracies do. And I think that is what India must do too. But what India seems to be doing is doing more on the welfare side because it is politically more expedient and easy and rewarding at a time when India is beginning to age. Now, when Japan aged, it was okay because Japan was very, very wealthy. But when Eastern Europe began aging, they were not that well off. India is beginning to age when India is poor. We talk about $5 trillion economy or $10 trillion economy, and we actually want India to be a developed economy. But the reality is that right now India is in the ranks of Nigeria, not even Brazil. So we have to be realistic, but we have to actually hang on to the truth, make it our friend, and then say, okay, you know what, this will focus our mind. I hope this focuses our mind.
Right. Great. My final question to both of you, Mr. Chhibber, you also, during the course of conversation, pointed that we need to reimagine the way we approach our country in terms of, addressing the bottlenecks. For example, the concept of 50 states, given the population we have. But given the electoral compulsion that we are in most of the times, irrespective of whoever is in power, do you think it's doable? Though these are great things to do, but do we have the bandwidth, the capacity, even if we have the will, but the compulsions, would they allow us to do it?
Well, I think, quite frankly, there was always this feeling that, in democracy is a setback to development. And I don't buy that argument anymore, because in election after election, you see that in the end, it is the capacity to systematically deliver, development. In the end, that's what really matters. And my sense is that people are wise enough to be able to see through, these kind of electoral gimmicks now more and more. And that where people who've been delivering development have been re-elected several times. So I think, we are a rambunctious democracy, and there's, as Churchill said, it's the worst form of government except for every other. So we don't have those choices. But I think what we are seeing is that, even within that sort of framework, you can now win elections on the basis of development performance. And I think the more of that we begin to see, the better direction that this country will go in. We have a saying in the book called Samriddh and Samriddh Sajat, and I would add the word Statat as well, which is, sustainable, continuous development, Bharat. That kind of thing we have to see. I mean, the democratic election process is a good thing in my view, because it reveals very quickly, lack of delivery and keeps governments honest wherever they go. Now, we could improve things a little bit by perhaps not having this, in the old days, the union government wouldn't get so involved in state elections, but now it seems to have become like every state election has become like a national election. So I think somehow we have to get through that. But this is not my area of expertise. But I do feel very strongly that that because India is a democracy, it cannot develop. That's not an acceptable situation for me. We have the government we have, and we will use that political framework to make progress, and we have made political progress in the past. The question step. We did the big reforms in 91 on the back of a crisis. Those have run out of steam now. We need to go through the next stage of reform, which will require much more collaborative cooperative federalism. You can't have this union government passing laws quietly and surreptitiously and then expect that the states will fall in line. That process will not work.
Absolutely. Final words from you, Mr. Soos. How do we make that political framework more nimble and more adjustable to the reality of removing the bottlenecks that we face?
Well, I think, first, I agree with Ajay completely that democracy is not, Indian democracy is not a hindrance to, good policy making, to my mind. Things can be sometimes difficult, but, there's give and take between different sections of society. I think those are compromises that democracies make, and that is, I think, what is more sustainable. If reforms were not possible, then P.V. Narasimha Rao and Dr. Manmohan Singh would not have been able to do anything in 1991. They were not a very strong government at that time. That being said, I think we also have to make sure that understand that the kind of democracy that we are talking about here is one that is inclusive, one which is a genuine democratic framework where people have a voice, where people can get their points across. I think we point out in the book, and that is no surprise, that Indian democracy has been backsliding. And we don't think that is good for India. We don't think that is good for the economy. The kind of divisiveness we often encounter these days, we don't think that is good for the economy, because it is going to have an impact. Any number of experts around the world, globally, they'll tell you that these are the kinds of things that will hurt countries like India. I know there's a fascination in some parts of India where people look to China and say China's autocratic model is really the model to emulate. I think my sense is that what President Xi is doing in China now may actually be detrimental to China's medium-term prospects. I think things may not be looking very rosy for China, given the way Mr. Xi has a centralized power. So we have to learn those kinds of lessons, not the wrong kinds of lessons. So democracy, genuine democracy, not electocracy in some ways, not just having elections, about people having a voice, people being able to compromise, people being able to, work together. Then I think that will have, that will be better. But how do you do that? That is not easy. But politicians have to learn to be able to, communicate better with Indian citizens. Indians are smart people. The public is very smart. They'll get it. They understand that if you are a poor person and you have to send your child to private school, you are being taxed by the government by not providing you basic public services. I think people are smart. Politicians need to communicate better, and they have to speak truth to the people. And that is what we have tried to do through this book.
Absolutely. And we are running short on time, but thank you so much, Mr. Chhibber and Mr. Soos, for joining us on this wonderful discussion today. And we hope to meet in person and do one more discussion very soon. Thanks
Thank
again.
you, Mr. Amin.
Thank you.
Thank you very
so
much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye.